Sometimes, the smallest voice in a silent room sounds like a warning you can't explain. Detroit, Motown Studio B, a misty evening, late 1968. The studio door shuttered before opening, emitting a long creak as if deliberately stretching the air. It made me shiver. Not because of the cold, but because I felt like I was about to step into something not entirely understandable. I'd been in this business long enough to know there are moments when the smallest sound is like a warning sign of a larger wave you haven't seen yet. The old yellow light streamed down the wooden floor, curling in long, wavy lines, as if waiting for the footsteps about to enter my life. I straightened up, put the headphones back on the console, and told myself to calm down. This fateful meeting had been arranged weeks in advance. I had to find something different for Motown, something that could change the game. And then they entered. 5 boys much smaller than I had imagined. All 5 stood in a line, as if aware that any disturbance could change the course of their lives. I could see the tension in their footsteps. But what caught my attention most was the boy at the end of the line, a boy so small he almost faded into his own shadow. He, Michael, held his hands behind his back, shoulders hunched as if to hide something. The light above shone down, making his face stand out against the thin layer of breath. The room was so quiet I could hear his breathing, rapid and even, like someone racing to catch the last train. I looked into his eyes. Something in his gaze made me take a deep breath. I've met many confident people, many people who are hungry for success, but this boy's eyes were different. Wary, sharp, and somehow racing against time itself. Not like fear, but like he was carrying a secret bigger than himself. I knew he was tired. I could feel it just by watching the breath rise and fall under his shirt. But this tiredness wasn't the kind of complaining or discouraged tiredness. It was like the tiredness of someone who was used to standing at the edge of his limits, then surpassing them, over and over again. A normal sign, but in this context, it was like a warning signal. I invited the group to stand around the microphone for an audition. The air in the studio tightened like a heart about to beat. I stood behind the thick glass of the control room, my finger on the sound bar, though I had never touched it before. As the 4 brothers began to perform, I took in each of them, the energy of a group of young men full of potential. But my mind was still fixed on the boy standing between them, who had remained silent all this time. Michael did not join in their confidence. Instead, he stood like a still point in the vortex, a silence so intense that I felt like 1,000 thoughts were hiding behind it. I realized this boy was not simply tired. He was struggling with something deeper. When the music stopped, I approached, kneeling down to eye level with him. "Are you okay?" I asked softly, avoiding pressure. Michael blinked. He was clearly choosing his words, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing that might reveal the truth he was keeping hidden. "I am a little tired." His voice was small, but not trembling. I sensed a kind of unforced honesty, and not a desire for sympathy. It was just a statement. Like a soldier reporting a situation before going into battle, the moment sent a chill down my spine. I looked at Tito and Jermaine, his 2 older brothers. They exchanged a quick glance. Not a worried glance. More like a well-rehearsed sign. "It'll be fine." This made the silence between Michael and me even more awkward. I stood up, took a half step back, trying to remain objective. But a feeling I couldn't name began to rise inside me. A kind of intuition so strong it felt like it was pushing me into a maze. I knew my job, to assess them. But here, it seemed, something was assessing me. I signaled the technician to turn the music back on, just to see what would happen. I wanted to hear each person's voice clearly before making any further decisions. But as the music began, I saw Michael stand up straighter, his eyes changing, clearer, deeper, more purposeful. He hadn't sung yet, but I sensed he was about to do something that would make it impossible for me to go back to the person I was a few seconds ago. I also felt, strangely, that I myself was on the brink of something beyond my control. something that would blow open the door that had just creaked open, but I had to keep the script for later. I couldn't let it all explode right now. I only knew one thing. The moment I looked into Michael Jackson's eyes, as tired as he was, he couldn't hide it. I knew there was something waiting to be revealed. Something no one in this room was quite ready to face. The studio had emptied. The remaining technicians moved silently, avoiding making noise, as if any sound might break the silence that held the air. I leaned against the edge of the console, my arms folded across my chest, my eyes fixed on the small figure huddled in the wooden chair. Michael. The boy propped his elbows on his knees, his fingers twirling a forgotten pencil. The motion was repetitive, rhythmic, a kind of heartbeat that replaced the fatigue that gripped his body. Tito and Jermaine stood nearby, playing the role of watchful older brothers, but I knew they were watching me too, waiting to see what I would decide. I left the console. My footsteps on the wooden floor echoed uncomfortably, like a countdown clock. This room, in the dark, had a way of turning simple movements into something unsafe. I approached Michael. "Are you sure you want to continue?" I asked, my voice low, as if I were talking to an adult. He looked up at me. Those eyes. I had never seen anything like them on a child. They weren't weak. They weren't scared. They weren't pleading. But they weren't pure confidence either. They were the eyes of someone who knew he was standing on the edge of something important, and still took another step. "I want to try. Just once." The words came out like the last breath of a long day. No trembling, no cry for help, just once. I felt a chill run down my spine, not because he was tired, but because of his attitude. The kind of attitude that made me afraid that if I didn't let him try, something inside him would break. I signaled the technician to get ready. No one said a word to anyone. The air seemed thick, clinging to everyone's shoulders. Only Michael sat still, his only movement a steady but labored breath, as if he were forcing himself not to tire. I stepped into the control room, standing behind the thick glass. The recording light came on, a red dot, a beacon, a warning. Michael stood up, walked to the microphone. His feet were light on the floor, but each step carried the energy of someone heading toward a place with no return. He stood straight, his eyes focused on the glass, where I was watching him. And then, the music began. On the first note of the song, I saw his shoulders jerk, not in surprise, but as if his body had answered itself. It was time. I leaned closer to the glass. Michael closed his eyes and opened his mouth. The voice came out, unlike anything I'd prepared in my head. It was clear, it was sharp, it was paradoxically powerful for a small body that trembled slightly under the spotlight. But what made me shiver was the emotion in his voice. As if he wasn't just singing along, he was reciting something that had been in his bones for a long time. I saw Tito and Jermaine standing out of frame, eyes wide. They knew their brother could sing, but they hadn't prepared for this moment. Not in this exhausted state. Not after a long day. Not when he'd nearly collapsed into his chair just a few minutes before. I remember hearing big voices, but Michael's voice wasn't big then. It was strange, as if it wasn't a matter of volume or technique, but of truth. A truth that took the listener's breath away. At the top, he changed his voice. A slide so smooth I thought a technician had added effects. I turned to look at the console. Nothing. There was only the sound of my soft, strained breathing. I turned back to the studio just as Michael opened his eyes. He looked straight at me, through the glass, through the lights, a look I couldn't avoid. It was as if it was asking, "Did you do it right? Did you make it? Or is this just what the adults expected of you?" I swallowed. Suddenly, I felt like I was no longer the judge. I was being interrogated by a child's voice. When the song stopped, I didn't react immediately. My hand rested on the edge of the console, but I couldn't feel the surface. There was only the sound of my own breathing, broken with each beat. Michael bowed his head, very slightly, almost invisible. but I saw. He exhaled as if he had shed the last layer of armor. He was too tired to sing. Everyone could see that. But he sang as if it were the last thing he had left. "Oh my God," one of the technicians muttered, then fell silent, afraid he'd ruined something sacred. I couldn't say anything right away. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my collar. Something had just happened. Something that couldn't be explained by experience, process, or music industry logic. I turned on the studio mic, trying to keep my voice from cracking. "Michael, you did, well?" He nodded slightly, then leaned back in his chair, as if all his strength had vanished as soon as the last note died. In those tired eyes, I saw no pride or complacency, just silence, a very deep silence, as if he'd just touched something he didn't even understand. The studio door opened slightly with the air conditioning, making a familiar creaking sound. This time, it didn't warn. It confirmed. That moment, that first take, was more than an experiment. It had just created something I didn't know what to call. I don't remember how long I stood there motionless after Michael finished his first take. The control room was strangely dark, not because the lights were off, but because the light seemed to be partially swallowed by the thick air that surrounded us all. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, steady but heavy, as if my body knew that the moment would not be easily digested. I turned to the technician. He was still glued to the monitor, his hands poised on the control panel, waiting for my command. A grown man who had recorded hundreds of voices, but at that moment he looked like a child trying to hide his surprise. "Rewind for me," I said, my voice low, trying to keep calm. "I want to listen to it from the beginning." He nodded and pressed the button. And then, something strange happened. Instead of playing back the recording, the control room speakers let out a long, harsh crackle that sounded like a tape being chewed to pieces. The sound sent a shiver down my spine. It sounded like the sharp breath of something trying to convey a distorted message. I stood up immediately. "What's going on?" The technician shook his head, his fingers tracing the row of buttons like someone searching for a leak in the electrical system. "I'm not sure. It was fine." I frowned. It wasn't the first time I'd had a technical problem, but tonight, things were going in a way that made me uneasy. It was like the control room didn't want us to hear the recording again. "Do it again," I demanded. The technician pressed the button a second time. Another crackle, longer, deeper, as if someone were turning a giant metal pipe upside down. Tito and Germaine stared at the glass from behind, trying to figure out what was going on inside. Michael remained still, a small figure in the middle of the wooden chair. He stared at the wall, his eyes unfocused, as if he had left his entire soul in the last note of music. I turned back to the technician, feeling like time was being distorted in this room. "Okay," I said. "Turn the whole system off. Back on." He did. The lights flickered. The console made a low hum. The room vibrated slightly as if the atmosphere had changed. "Try again." He pressed the button. And this time, the sound came out suddenly. No static, no distortion, no lag. The sound was so clear that it was unnatural. I froze for a moment. Every note in Michael's voice sounded as if someone had sharpened it with a knife. Every breath, every pause sounded sharp, like the studio was stretching the truth to an unhealthy degree. I felt like I was listening to something other than a recording. It was like a recording of the truth, stretched to the point where every rough edge was exposed. As Michael transitioned, I had to grip the edge of the console. My skin prickled. I'd heard hundreds of live recordings in my life, but none had made me feel like I was being watched by the sound itself. I leaned toward the speakers, trying to analyze what made this recording so unusual. But the more I tried, the less I could. The first recording of a boy exhausted. And it sounded like a command. No one in the control room dared to move. The technician stopped breathing. Neither did I. I glanced at the glass. Michael wasn't looking at us. He was still sitting there, his eyes distant, as if he knew something we didn't. The 9 or 10-year-old boy was lost in his own thoughts, and I, much older, felt uneasy. The recording ended. The silence that followed wasn't natural silence. It was thick. It was cold. It had weight. I turned around, slowly asking, "Was there something wrong with the tape?" The technician shook his head so hard I was afraid his neck would break. "No, not at all. This is exactly what we just recorded." My feet froze. I took a deep breath, because in that moment, I realized something. What just played back, it sounded even stronger than what I remembered Michael singing. Not stronger in volume, not better in technique, but stronger in a way, as if the record were reminding me of something, a message, a warning, an unspoken truth. I braced my hands on the console, head bowed, trying to steady my heartbeat. "I have to listen again," I ordered. No one objected. The second play went smoothly, but I began to realize it wasn't the music that changed, it was us that changed. In the presence of that sound, we were the ones being observed. As the record ended once more, I knew one thing for sure. From this moment on, things at Motown would never be the same. No one said anything, but everyone knew. For the first time in years of producing, I felt unprepared. I wasn't prepared to face what that voice would bring, unable to name the feeling that had just crept into the studio. I looked over at Michael. He was still sitting there, completely unaware that he had just changed the atmosphere of the room, as if the boy had just done something beyond his comprehension. The Motown hallways at around 2 a.m. always had a distinct smell. The smell of electricity heated up after a long day, mixed with the scent of old paper and sweat from dreams waiting to be molded into something great. But that night, the smell was unusually unpleasant. Not because I was tired, but because I knew I was about to enter a place I wouldn't easily leave. The conference room at the end of the hallway was lit up. White light glaring down on the tabletop, creating a cold, interrogation room atmosphere. I pushed the door open, and Michael's first take record lay in my breast pocket, making a low sound that only I could hear, a final warning before the night's events were turned upside down. Inside, familiar faces were present. The production manager, the A&R guy, the 2 guys with final say at Motown. They all looked at me as if I'd just dragged them out of bed to witness a case they didn't know the details of. "Hal, if you're saying urgent at this hour, you better be serious," one of them said, his voice hoarse, not yet fully awake. I didn't answer. I put the tape on the table, a small but heavy action, like placing a hot piece of evidence in the middle of a courtroom. "Listen," I said, keeping my tone as calm as possible, though my heart was racing like an engine. A guy smacked his lips. "Another kid band?" "If it was just kids," I said, "I wouldn't have woken you." No one laughed. I nodded to the technician on duty. He turned on the machine. The small light on the tape player lit up like a red eye, illuminating every person in the room. Then the music began. Michael's first line seemed to cut straight into the sinking air. A high note, but not ostentatious. A gentle emotion, but not weak. There was something too real about the voice, too sharp, too ripe for the body of a child. I watched for reactions. At first, everyone kept their faces blank as if they were used to hearing something good. But after a few seconds, I saw one person's lips freeze. Another frowned. Another tilted his head as if to make sure the speakers weren't being tuned. When Michael entered the vocal transition, the very moment that sent chills down my spine in the studio, the room froze. No more chair scraping, no more snorting from sleep, no more pen tapping on desk, nothing but the voice of a boy both exhausted and beyond himself. The recording stopped. No one spoke for the first few seconds. They sat like statues. I felt the room hold its breath. It was like Motown, an entire music empire, was waiting for someone to speak first to decide whether to continue living or change their fate that very night. Finally, one of them let out a soft sigh. No way. Not a denial, not a doubt, just the words of someone trying to understand something that defied logic. Another laughed, but it was a forced laugh. "Hey, Hal, you sure you didn't let anyone adjust your voice while we were sleeping?" "I was standing there the whole time," I replied, not backing away. One of them leaned toward me, his voice low enough to hide it from the others. "That voice sounds like a grown singer, not a kid his age." Another, more reserved, interjected, "And is this kid really tired?" "I think," I replied, "he's more tired than we know." They looked at each other, one after the other, as if communicating a kind of fear that no one wanted to name. They didn't doubt the talent. They doubted its meaning. Something about that voice, the way it resonated so strongly, even when the boy's body was clearly exhausted, disturbed them. Then the plot twist happened. One of the men in the room leaned back, clasping his hands together in front of his chest. "Maybe," he said, "we should try it with a grown-up to make it more commercial. Kids are unpredictable." The atmosphere changed. I felt my liver hit my chest. Not because I was angry, but because I knew this was coming. But I hadn't thought it would come so quickly on the first night. I stood up straight, my hands flat on the table. "No," I said, clearly but not loudly. "That's Michael's voice, and it's going to stay that way." A heavy silence fell over the room. The other tilted his head. "You'd bet your position on a first record by a boy who's barely breathing?" I looked straight at him. I could feel Michael through the glass of the studio, still looking down at his old shoes. He didn't know what was going on here, but I knew something in his eyes. The eyes that had met mine mid-song was demanding that I take his side. "Not a record," I said, "the truth." Another silence fell, longer, deeper, so tight I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. Then someone nodded, another exhaled. A third smiled, unhappy but accepting. No one else in the room objected. The tape on the table looked like irrefutable evidence, like a verdict had been passed. The night meeting was over. No one said another word. But I knew. I had just caused a change that no one had anticipated. Not just in Motown, but in my own future. As I walked out of the conference room, the long hallway seemed to be watching me. I heard my footsteps, heavy and quick, as if I were running away from a decision or running toward it. I didn't know. All I knew was this. The night Motown held its breath was the night a 9 or 10-year-old boy, exhausted and shaking, made the world take a deep breath before facing what was to come. There's a silence in the studio at dawn that I hate to face. It's not the silence of exhaustion, nor the silence of the end. It's the kind of silence that makes you hear your own thoughts, and there's nowhere to hide. I returned to Studio B after the night meeting that felt like a secret interrogation. It was just me and my long shadow on the wall. The room was large but felt like a closed box, trapping me in things I hadn't yet acknowledged. I stood in the middle of the room, looking at the microphone still dangling. The small light above it still glowing a faint red, as if it hadn't been turned off since the previous recording. Michael was still sleeping on the wooden chair, a tired sleep, head tilted to one side, arms curled around his body. Tito and Jermaine had fallen asleep in the corner, leaning against each other in silence. I paused to look at them, the feeling inside me heavy, lingering. The reason I returned to the studio wasn't just to listen to the recording again, because I couldn't sleep without understanding what had really happened that night. I sat down in the control chair. I took the tape out of my pocket, just a small tape, inanimate, cold, but inside it was something that made a room full of adults stop breathing at once. I put the tape in. The clicking of the gears sounded like a lock turning in an invisible interrogation room. I put the headphones on, took a slow breath, then pressed play. The sound came out, not through the studio speakers this time, but straight into my ears. It felt even more powerful than through the speakers. Each breath the boy took became so close, it felt like he was standing next to my shoulder. Each pause between the lines rang out not as silence, but as confession. Michael sang with a determination that made me choke. He was tired. He was exhausted. He was just asking to try just once. And yet, in the very moment that little boy touched the microphone, he poured out an emotion not of childhood, but of a heart that had learned to endure more than it should. I listened to the high notes again. I was not used to that feeling. It felt like I was being forced by that voice to look at the truth. I had misjudged the boy from the very beginning. When the song ended, I took off my headphones. My whole body felt like it was falling freely into a heavy silence. I turned to look at Michael again. He was still sleeping. Not a peaceful sleep, but the sleep of someone who had just poured all his energy into one side of himself without thinking of the consequences. I walked closer to him, kneeling down like I had at the beginning of the evening. Looking at that little face, I remembered the look he had given me while he was singing, a look that did not ask for permission, did not plead for help, did not challenge. It had only one thing: trust. A strange trust, so much so that it felt like he was handing my dream over to me, even though I never said I deserved it. Now, as I watched him sleep, I felt something tighten deep in my chest. Not because of worry, but because I understood. That first take moment would stay with me for the rest of my life. A soft sound rang out. I turned my head. Michael stirred, opened his eyes, tired but alert. He looked around, perhaps to check if the world was still there. Then he saw me. "Uncle, listen to the recording again?" His voice was hoarse, traces of exhaustion still lingering. I nodded. "Do you know what you just did?" He tilted his head slightly, as if trying to understand the question. "I just sang." A simple answer, too simple, but it was profound in a way that left me speechless for a few seconds. "Good," I replied softly. "Very good." He nodded, his eyes half closed, as if he were about to fall back asleep. I stood up, turning my back to the darkness of the control room. But before I left, I heard him whisper, his voice as small as a breath, "I just want to do it right." The words struck me hard, not because of the sincerity, but because of the loneliness in them. A boy so tired he could hardly stand, but still said, "I just want to do it right." A boy who didn't know what industry pressure was, didn't know what a hit was, didn't know what a legend was, but sang as if he understood everything. I turned back to look. He was asleep again, his breathing more even. I walked out of the studio, my hand still touching the pocket where the tape lay. This time, the studio door didn't creak open. It slid open softly, unnaturally silent. It was as if the room itself knew what had just happened in it would never happen the same way again. No lights, no digital, no big orchestra. Just one breath from an exhausted boy. One breath that changed everything. I left Studio B before dawn, stepped out onto the long street in the cold Detroit wind, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had just witnessed the beginning of something much bigger than myself. It wasn't discovering talent. It wasn't finding a star. It wasn't Motown's opportunity. I was there, the moment a legend was made, in the very first breath.